Reading is good for you, right? So let's find out more.
No matter what the age, I think we all know that reading does our brains good, but does it matter what we read? Yes, it actually does. And when it comes to reading fiction or nonfiction, there really is a difference on how our language skills are affected. Raymond Marr is a professor of psychology at York University, and he's done extensive research into this, particularly on how it affects young people's verbal skills. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Marr.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I think before we get into the benefits of specifically what we read, can you just explain in general, why is reading so good for us?
Sure, absolutely. I think reading's good for us for a lot of different reasons, but the most obvious one is that it teaches us about language. I mean, it's predominantly the way that we learn about new words. It's how we learn how to read. And so I think that, children especially benefit from reading when it comes to learning, how to speak and how to read.
Okay, so is that because children are, their brains are growing and taking everything in, and so it plays such a pivotal role at that point?
Sure, and absolutely, and also because, they don't have all that much exposure to language. They have conversations, that sort of thing, but by way of structured instruction about how language is, about grammar, that really does come from reading.
Okay. And then let's now delve into your research and how you looked at, I think, 1,000 young adults, right? And the role that fiction plays specifically.
Right, yeah. So, past research has showed that, children that read more for leisure, read for pleasure, they become better readers, and they sort of find it easier to read, and therefore they read more, and they get this sort of upward circle of benefit. So in other words, the rich get richer. The more you read, the better you get at reading. The more you read, and the more your reading abilities improve. And so what we were interested in is whether there's any difference in what you read, and we looked at this in a very broad way, looking at the difference between reading fiction as opposed to reading nonfiction. And what we found across 4 different studies, based on almost 1,000 young adults, is that there was a difference. That fiction had a much stronger association with verbal abilities of all kinds compared to nonfiction.
So then my next question, because I immediately imagine the way fiction makes your brain kind of, dream, right? Your imagination comes into play. Is that what's going on? It's the way that it stimulates the brain?
It could be. I will say that we don't know for sure why there is this difference. One possibility is that stories evoke a lot more emotions, and we know that emotions really help us when it comes to our memory. We remember things that are more emotional. It could also be that, stories evoke much more of a rich context, and that sort of more elaborated context really helps us to remember new words, or we might even be more motivated to look up a word that we don't know if we're trying to understand a story, whereby if we're reading, an essay or something, we might just sort of gloss over it, especially if we're reading it for school or for work.
And then I understand that there was a follow-up study done at Concordia University. Was that for older aged readers?
In that study, it was similar age readers, but we were looking at something slightly different. We were looking at the different motivations that people have for reading, so what motivates them to engage in reading. And what we found was when those motivations were the kind that would push you towards fiction, they tended to have stronger language skills. But if those motivations sort of nudged you towards nonfiction, they actually tended to have worse verbal abilities.
Really?
Oh.
Huh. Okay, so what, bottom line with this is, I suppose if we're reading and looking to have our brains, our verbal skills improve, it sounds like I could use some verbal skill improvement right at this moment. The idea is you should gravitate towards fiction.
Yeah, I think, for the evidence that we have available, it's definitely the amount of fiction that we read that is the better predictor of all kinds of verbal skills, like, the breadth of our vocabulary, our ability to understand, passages, understand analogies, all kinds of things. So, yeah, I think that would be the take-home message.
Right,
wow, that's fascinating. I never would have thought that. I just would have thought the reading is reading. But if you're reading fiction or nonfiction, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for the time this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, Raymond Marr, professor at York. Do you read mostly fiction or nonfiction?
So it's interesting. Normally, I'm all about fiction, but since I've been getting back into reading, because during the pandemic, I basically haven't been reading, gotten back into it recently, and I've been reading more nonfiction. But I'm a fiction person, all the time. Usually.
And I'm mostly a nonfiction
You're a nonfiction
person most
guy,
of the time.
yeah.
But every now and then I'll fall off and read and I like when I read fiction, but just not my first choice.
And we
I go
both
nonfiction.
started reading more again recently, but both nonfiction.
Yeah, I started ordering more. I'm not sure if I'm reading more, but it's a first step. So.
I did just order a fiction book, first one in a while.